We'll come back to what you found out about kind of what works in addressing these situations. But first I want to kind of explore a bit more about kind of what you found about unmet needs. So the Grattan Cities programme, the clues in the title, is focusing on cities. The report covers both urban and non-urban areas, but just if you don't mind kind of focusing on cities for a second, what groups of people did you find to be most vulnerable in cities, and what kinds of vulnerability did they have?
Well, cities are weird and complex places, and the institution I now work really began its life doing work on, as it were, the social needs of cities in the 1950s, when Michael Young and a man called Peter Wilmot did a sociological study on family and kinship in East London. And their first book is still in print as a Penguin classic. And essentially that said that the city had become, in the 19th century, been really bad at meeting people's needs. 19th century British cities were pretty close to hell. Very high crime, very high disease, very, very poor, absolutely no trust, no reason to trust anyone else because they might stab you down a dark alleyway sort of thing. And then learnt over a period of 50 or 60 years how to create pretty strong communities, often in the working class and middle class areas, strong networks of mutual support. In the working class areas, mainly organised by women, looking out for each other, children playing together in the streets. And then in the 40s and 50s, wise governments built tower blocks to decamp people from these terrible slums, and in the tower blocks they basically destroyed all the social networks which made life bearable, leaving people isolated, fearful, and so on. So I say our institution began in trying to understand the relationship between physical design and psychological well-being and social support. In some ways, the picture of cities which comes out from here is, let's say, it is a pretty complicated one. So in some ways, for young people coming into a big city, the city is giving them opportunities, networks, fun, excitement, anonymity, good aspects of anonymity, which they love. Many of the refugees coming from all over the world, we would sort of see them as incredibly needy, and yet they would actually present themselves as pretty lucky to be in this city where they weren't at risk of, torture, abuse, civil war, etc. And it was a reasonably sort of benign environment for them. And then, though, for older people, we found large numbers of older people in a city like London whose whole world had disappeared around them. They had been perhaps living in the same street, perhaps the same tower block for 30 or 40 years, but all of their friends, all of their neighbours who they'd known had gone. And in their place were people from all over the world had moved in, but who never talked to them. And so they didn't go out at all. They didn't talk to anyone else from week to week, and they had this feeling of sort of being embattled and cut off while kind of life had gone off into the future. There were other groups of teenagers, the teenage mums in southeast London, for whom in some ways the most striking message from them was fear. Fear of a new geography of violence, which meant that if they, a bit like sort of New York and Chicago, if they walked one street wrong, they would be at risk of attack by another gang, a knife-wielding gang. And so for them, the city was this place of a geography invisible largely to adults or the state, of some safe zones and lots of very dangerous zones. So some I was saying one shouldn't generalise. The answers to your questions turn out to be really very, very diverse in the different groups living in a city. That said, one of the things we're now doing in the wake of this study, the British, the UK is building, perhaps unwisely, a number of new towns. Rather like Australia, we expect our population to go up quite sharply in the next 10 or 20 years. And indeed, Britain's the only European country which expects significant population growth in the near future, and therefore is building these sort of new estates and new towns all over the place. We found, about a year or two ago, we did some work with the developers, the planners, the architects of these new towns, and we found they had forgotten or never known almost all the lessons on social design. How do you make places ones which are livable? They were very good on physical structures, very good on ecological design. They could do a low carbon, low water use community easily, but social design had been forgotten. There was no sociology there, no lessons. So we're now working with a group of them in a sense to answer the question, how do you build a new development of 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 homes in a way which will make it a really good place where people want to live, and not to repeat the normal experience across Europe and North America that these new developments, unless they're very upmarket, drift into being sinks and often scarred by crime, or in France they're where the riots take place and so on. And we're just beginning that, and it gets you into the real detail of how do you organise lines of sight and public spaces and walkways and so on.
So your work is focused on the UK, but you have worked in Australia over a number of years, including advising the current Prime Minister here. What do you think, and whereas you don't kind of know in detail and so on, but how do you think that this research might be relevant here in Australia?
Well, obviously you mentioned rural areas, and Australia has many much more remote communities than anywhere in the UK, and undoubtedly there's a different pattern which I could have talked about of rural need has changed in nature over time for all sorts of reasons, and that will be the case here. I should say there's a parallel study to this done in Portugal using the same methodology. We have a branch office of the Young Foundation in Portugal, and Portugal has the slightly unfortunate attribute of being the most unequal country in Europe alongside Britain. Their study came up with a very similar sets of issues about trust and psychological need and so on. My sense is that Australia has been much better at talking about some of these things than, say, the UK or the US. Has been at least more at ease talking about mental health, mental illness, and about psychosocial need and its implications for public policy and spending and so on than the UK. But in a way, what I would hope someone might do is perhaps do a version of this, because everywhere is different. And part of what we've done here is we try to distill sort of methodologies for how do you make sense of a place. And it's actually on the website, not in the report. We set out a number of methods for looking at a community or a place and mapping. So it's two sets of things. One, how is it doing now? What's its current well-being, its income level, its health and so on, but also how well placed is it for the future? What are its strengths and what are its weaknesses? And those assets and strengths will partly be individual ones, about say, personal characteristics, social supports and structures and so on. And the weaknesses will usually be the absence of those. And we would like to see many more people doing this sort of work, because most local indicator sets around the world don't really get into this fine grain of strengths and weaknesses and resilience and so on. Yet this is probably what one most needs to know about any town or city or suburb.